Thanks so much, and thanks so much for inviting me to do this. I think I got a call or an email from Jan Kaiser some months ago. Jan and I have worked together for years on all kinds of programs. Hard to think back as to how many. But anyway, I was delighted when she and Larry were in cahoots and asked me to moderate this session. I first met Larry Baker over the phone when he called the Iowa Arts Council. I'm not quite sure, I don't remember how I ended up with you, but it might have been just a happenstance of whoever answered the phone. And we started talking about, he was interested in writing a grant for Flamingo Rising, which he's in the process of making into a film. And it started a conversation, I want to say, what, 4 years ago? 5? 3? It seems longer somehow.
Thanks so much.
Anyway, it started a conversation and then a friendship. And then what ended up happening was he sent me one at Flamingo Rising to read, which was a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, you're in for a treat. I told my book club about it, and the book club started reading it, and then he came to the book club. And then we read another book, and he came to that book club too. And there's another book club in town, and we share some people, not people in common in the book clubs, but we sort of found out by accident that the other book club was also inviting Larry, and so we were in competition for who was going to provide the best evening for him. But we think we're best. But anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about him. Professionally, Larry published his first short story when he was 15, and then there was kind of a drought, right? He was running, he was running a movie theater, which shows up in many of his books, but most prominently in, Flamingo Rising and not Athens, America, but The Good Man, which is also, they're all wonderful books. Anyway, his second book his short story was published when he was 30, and let's see, he tells people that he was honing his craft all that time. I think he was just watching a lot of movies. But it was worth it because the films and his love of illusion and delusion show up in all of his books, as well as the concepts of unreliable narrators, which are, he's into ambiguity in a big way, which is something I'm interested in as well. So I've enjoyed his books just for the stories, but also for the way he writes, and he is a lovely writer. It's elegant in the way he puts stories together and paints his characters. But let's see, for the next 20 years after story number 2, he earned a total of $300 from his published writing, more than many of us have earned. Then he wrote his first novel, Flamingo Rising, which I just noted. And as he said, it was rejected by 14 publishers. Went to work in a bookstore, tried one more agent, made another phone call, and a year later he was touring bookstores in England and Ireland. Flamingo was adapted for television by Hallmark and published in 12 foreign languages. It's an amazing success. 3 novels later, Larry's an Iowa writer with an Iowa publisher. And as he says, dumb luck and perseverance are a writer's best friends. I'd say perseverance is probably top of the list. So as he's doing his reading, I'm sure you might have some questions. You have a form. And after he is done reading and talking, we'll be doing a Q&A that I will be moderating. And if you don't talk, I have to, so please ask questions. And I think that's, kind of made the most of the points. And also realized that a lot of his life shows up in his books, characters. I think Athens, America will strike people as probably the most familiar because it's about Iowa City and local government, and is an interesting commentary on that. I'm particularly fond of some of the other books because one of the things we found when we first started talking was that we share a love of the South. He was born there. I became a migrant there for many years, and all of his books have something about St. Augustine, Florida in them. And I will let him introduce you to that. Thank you, and Larry Baker.
Thank you, Ricky, and thank the Des Moines Library for having me. I'm very honored. I'm going to probably repeat a few things that Ricky said because, one, from where I'm sitting, I didn't understand a word she said. So if you've heard anything that I tell you about myself from her, smile, and just nod. That's great. What Ricky neglected to tell you is that this is her last official act as an Iowa resident. She has accepted a position at the Oregon State or University of Oregon? University of Oregon, and she'll be moving up to Eugene, and will no longer be working for the Iowa Arts Council, and it is their loss and Oregon's gain. So, and Ricky, I've had the great pleasure of knowing you, and I will miss you, and we do have emails, so you can't disappear completely. And so I expect all sorts of, just like you did in Des Moines, I expect all sorts of gossip from Oregon as well. One other thing that Ricky forgot to tell you is that my second book, the one that's based on Iowa City, that book was published about a year before I ran for re-election on the city council, and I came in 5th after that. Sense of humor. I don't know where it went, but I tended to upset people. But that's all right, because I have all the remaining copies of that book in my basement now. It's disappeared from. If you want a copy of that book, you really have to contact me personally, because it will not be anywhere sold. I was asked to talk about a little bit of how I got here, and I'm a little bit surprised myself. I started writing very early and publishing short stories very early, but as most writers who have published short stories will tell you, there is absolutely no money in that. There's no career in that. The satisfaction comes from seeing your name in print, plus you get 3 free copies of whatever magazine or literary journal you were in. I didn't start making money until my late 30s, and then I sat down and decided to write a novel based upon my experience in the movie business. Now, when I was single, that was a great line to say, I'm in the movie business, and I can get you in the movies. But what it really meant was I owned a movie theater, and I could get you into the movie theater free. 15 years, I ran indoor theaters, outdoor theaters. I ran the largest drive-in theater in America at the time. And every so often, I'd have one of those experiences that I would think to myself, this would make a great story. I found a dead woman on the toilet one time in my drive-in theater and had to wait 5 hours before I could pick her up and carry her back to her car and put her behind the wheel of her car, because it was her property and not my property, and it was a lot less to explain that way. Now, I say that, and people tend to not believe that, but I turned it into a story. That and the fireworks, setting funeral homes on fire and selling sex education books door to door and things like that. And at every moment, there's always this sudden pause where you think, I really got to turn that into a story, which I think is the common trait with all writers. You begin with a story. You might have a plot, you might have a character, but you're going to turn it into a story. And the difference between writers and people that want to write is that writers actually go ahead and do it. Sometimes they get published, and that was the next fortunate step. I finished the book. I didn't like it. I put it away, and then I adopted 2 children. And as soon as I adopted the 2 children, I realized what was wrong with the book. I had the wrong person telling the story. I had me telling the story as the crazy theater manager. And what I did was I made the narrator of the book a 45-year-old Korean adoptee looking back at his childhood, living with totally insane parents, which would be me and my wife, by the way. And as soon as that took off, I finished the book very quickly, got an agent who loved it, and then spent the next 1.5 years being rejected by 15 different publishers who kept saying, this is a great book, looks great on the screen, don't know what I can do with it. Changed agents. The next agent had the book 2 weeks, made 1 phone call, and sold it for a fair amount of advance money. And that was the beginning of my career. So from that point, I am here. I have written 4 novels. Let me rephrase that. I have published 4 novels and written probably about 12. And some of those will get rewritten, and some of those will never, ever see the light of day. This particular novel that I want to read from tonight is very, very different from anything I have ever written. And I'm trying to be delicate, diplomatic, and phrase this right. It's about a crazy woman who is trying to explain to her therapist how she thought she could have a 20-year affair with a younger man and get away with it. And as the story progresses, I'm unfair. She's not crazy, she's delusional. And what you discover is that her therapist might be crazy too. So the book opens with two women. One's a patient, one's a professional therapist, telling a story. And then you find out that the therapist thinks this woman is lying, knows this woman's lying, but is intrigued by the story. And then you get a flashback to the young man. You discover that when he was 14 years old, his mother left him with two smaller children and a crippled father. And from the age of 14, he has had to take care of his family. He's very smart, very bright, has a few sort of, learning disability problems, but he overcomes those. And he works two jobs and takes care of his family. One of those jobs is the important one, is he works in a movie theater. An old, giant palace of a movie theater. And then when he turns 18, he is going to go to college. And so what I'm going to read you today is the scene in which he meets the woman he's going to have the affair with. She is his teacher, and she is a performer. Her name is Alice, but what you'll discover as the book progresses is that might not be her real name. You also discover, I'm not giving too much away, within the first few pages of the book, you will discover that she's dying. So everything is a flashback as the therapist keeps pushing her to explain what it is. What was the compulsion, the attraction that drove you to this affair and maintained it for so long, and the fact that your husband eventually knew about it, and you juggled these two men in your life, and both of them evidently cared very, very much for you. So with that as a setup, I'm going to read that chapter where they first meet. And to do that, I have to change glasses. Some of you understand exactly what I'm doing here. And I'm also not going to read from the book. I had to print it out in 20-point font to be able to see it at any distance at all. So this chapter is called Introductions and Gifts. My name is Alice Marcher. I'm your teacher, for better or for worse, and tomorrow is my birthday, and I expect presents. Danny is sitting in the back of the room, near the door, sullen and slouching, wearing baggy black jeans and a white Oxford cloth shirt that was 2 sizes too big. He was going to work after class. Because there was a freakishly large boy in front of him, he had to lean sideways to get a good view of his teacher. That was when she first saw him too, his head appearing as if out of the shoulder of a giant. 10 years later, in bed together, they would both misremember the moment. Neither would claim it was love at first sight, but both wanted that first eye contact to have had some significance. With him almost 30 and her turning 40, they were breaking up for the second time, and there was a lot of history to romanticize. In another few years, they would break up for a third and final time. But whereas all three had been her idea, the second breakup was mutual and sentimental. They had convinced themselves that they were doing the logical thing, so that second time was important to organize their history between them, to reminisce, to even videotape a tour of St. Augustine as they drove around and talked to each other about all the places that meant something to them. But they still glossed over that first look with too much sentiment. Their first private words to each other, however, were etched indelibly. That day in class, Alice had looked at Danny and smiled. The head out of the shoulder image was amusing to her, but it was the opening day of her own drama, and she had a script to follow. Danny was just another of her audience, another member of her audience. She said, "I would prefer diamonds, but use your best judgment." The dean had warned her about irony, about most students' failure to understand it. Alice didn't care. The dean was her husband. He understood her, and she always assumed that he would protect her. The woman Danny saw that morning seemed tall, but was not, with long black hair pulled tightly behind her ears and a face that was interesting but not beautiful, and the individual features were unremarkable. But the sum of her face was in her eyes, and those other features, as soon as Danny got close to her, coalesced around those dark brown eyes and became a seduction. In all the years of looking at that face, Danny never saw it change, except when they were about to have sex. And eventually it seems as if most of their time together was always a slow dance leading to sex, so her face was not as it was when you first saw it, but more often as it was when their bodies came closer together, soon to be one. Alice had no impression of Danny until the end of that first class. Roll taken, syllabus explained, first assignment given, she dismissed class early. And as she made her opening presentation, she had slowly walked around the room, forcing her students to turn their heads and follow her, finishing her waltz at the back of the room, a few feet away from Danny. "See you tomorrow. Reading quiz first. Extra points for presents. And now, go and sin no more," she had said, opening the door behind Danny and standing back as the rush began. Within seconds, the only people left in the room were her, Danny, and the giant student in front of him, who was having trouble getting out of the standard-sized desk. Alice first really noticed Danny when he stood up. He was over 6 feet tall and had remarkable blue-green eyes. Her first impression was that he was a young man who had probably done time in the military and was starting his life over, perhaps mid to late 20s, 30 at the outside. And the most incongruous part of his appearance was that his hair was too long for his face. A man his age, she thought, would look better with a good haircut, but he certainly had potential. As Danny had stood, he had taken a more direct look at her face while she was looking the other direction. She had looked younger from a distance, and her wedding ring was obvious when she came closer. The turning point for her, the moment Danny separated himself from the blur of her other thoughts that morning, was when he turned back to help the other student get out of his desk. He put one hand on the back of the chair to hold it in place and offered his other hand to the giant, who squirmed out and then up from his desk, grunting as he rose, his red face beaded with sweat. He thanked Danny for his help, but seeing his teacher, he lowered his head and left the room embarrassed. Alice watched him lumber past her and then turned back to see Danny staring at her. His face was different. He was stunning. It was this moment of their history they both remembered accurately, their first private conversation. He had asked, "What do you really want for your birthday?" The thing that she remembered best about that moment was that she was at first speechless, because she was still thinking about him helping the giant. It seemed like such a kind gesture, almost gracious, as if Danny were a servant and a lord at the same time. And she was aware that she was staring at his face as if he had stepped off a movie screen and entered her world. She finally said, "I want to be surprised." The conversation lasted 20 more minutes, the two of them not moving from that spot at the back of the classroom, in no hurry since the next class would not start for half an hour. The opening 2 sentences were all they remembered, but that was enough. The rest was just small talk between teacher and new student. details to supply a context. Personal traits were revealed immediately, traits that might have required weeks or months to be revealed around someone else, someone who was a close friend, someone who could be trusted, but revealed instantaneously with each other within minutes of meeting. As she and Danny talked that first morning, she started to think about him in ways that she had thought about other men. But then she discovered that he was 18, a shock to her and disappointing because it narrowed his appeal. As mature as he seemed, as much of an adult as he was required to be by his home life, he was still too young, handsome, but a child. She had made many mistakes in her life, wrong choices in men, but cradle robbing was not on that list, and other women she knew could joke about young, hard boys as perfect lovers, quickly renewable and easily disposable. But Alice had a horror of becoming a cliche. Danny went to the Center Theater and sorted his feelings. In their constant self-analysis over the years, Alice most resented his refusal or his inability to express those feelings. When he had told her that he went to work that first day and did not think about her, her feelings had been hurt. But he was untruthful. She admitted to looking forward to seeing him again, and he had tried to convince her that he had not thought about her. So she reminded him that he had indeed brought her a present on her birthday, so he must have thought of her after that first day, right? Of course, he admitted, but not evidently as much as she had thought about him. And the pattern was established early. She did most of the talking, and he was silent a lot, silence that she somehow interpreted as depth, but that he knew was merely insecurity. My God, Alice, he would tell her on his 30th birthday, I was a teenager. You were a married woman with a master's degree, my teacher. I was absolutely intimidated by you for those first few years. I thought I would bore you, and besides, you had no problem doing most of the talking. But he had thought about her that first afternoon, about how nobody else in class seemed to understand her humor, how she walked, how she had stood next to him as class ended, and he first noticed how she smelled. The only other woman whose smell he could remember was his mother. Hers was sweeter than Alice's, almost heavy sweet, almost whorish, and it had never faded in Danny's mind. Alice's smell was lighter, virginal, and sensual at the same time, if that could be a smell, but it had been enough to have him keep his notebook in front of him as he talked to her after class. He sat in the Center Theater later and thought about going to Sears or Penny's after work to the perfume counter, testing every sampler until he found the same smell, and buying her a tiny bottle. That would be the perfect gift. But his sister needed to be taken shopping for a new swimsuit he had promised her, and his father had a prescription to refill, and there was no time, as always, for Danny to shop for himself. So he improvised. Alice stood in front of her class the next day and asked, "And my presents?" With a mute group in front of her, she glanced at Danny, but he did not look back. Disappointed, she laughed. "Why is it that nobody ever believes me? Every year the same." "Oh, well, I'll just add some extra questions to the quiz." That they believed. After class, Danny lingered, waiting for all the others to leave the room, including the giant, and Alice knew he had something for her. She stayed at her podium. Mr. Shea, you're my last hope. Bring that diamond up here." Another moment they would remember. He walked to the front of the room and handed her an envelope, obviously a birthday card. Inside the card were 2 passes to the Center Theater. Alice almost cried. "Oh, Danny, how did you know I love the movies?" "Everybody likes the movies," he had said. "Not like me, Danny, not like me." That's their first day. And what you get after that is we follow Danny back to the theater. We watch him in operation. We, the writer and the reader, see how the movies are made. His job as a projectionist to what bells he has to ring, levers to pull, film to thread, carbon arcs to line. And what you see is it's a very mechanical operation, this whole illusion. And that chapter explains what a theater screen is made out of. A movie screen is made out of something not much thicker than a Band-Aid. It's a very thin, perforated plastic. And behind the center of the screen, behind that thin plastic, is this giant speaker horn. This is an old theater. And so there's a heavy curtain in front, and that curtain opens, and behind the heavy curtain is a sheer, transparent, wavy curtain, which the picture comes on the screen through that curtain, and it's a wavy sort of picture, and then that opens up too. And the lights go down, the blue floodlights, and it's at that point when the theater gets really dark that you can look up, and remember these old theaters, you can look up into the ceiling, and it looks like stars. There's hundreds of little specks, little white dots in the ceiling. And he has to control that all at the same time. She takes those passes, goes to the theater with another man. Now, Alice has a bit of a problem. She has been unfaithful to her husband many times. Now, what you'll discover by about halfway through the book is why. It's not his fault, but something explains Alice's behavior. She's very casual about it. And Danny's upset when he sees her with another man. He takes her to the projection booth one night. They stand between the two projectors, and he puts his arms around her, and he does the whole setup, and holding her hands, and has her follow his direction to pull this and to look through the little window and watch where the cue mark is to make the changeover. So she understands all that. And she just thinks that's even greater. That knowing how it works is it's like knowing the magic trick and still loving the trick. So one night, he says, I have a surprise for you. Come to the theater. That's all I'm going to tell you. It's midnight. Alice was alone the first time she stood on the center stage at midnight, having snuck out of her house while her husband slept the sleep of innocence she envied. Danny was in the projection booth. He had led her to the stage in the dark, telling her to keep her eyes closed. Then he placed her between the sheer curtain and the screen and told her to wait with her eyes closed until he told her to open them. Of course, as soon as she knew he was gone, she opened her eyes. But that first moment was almost death dark, and she was afraid. She put her hands out and touched the curtain, not expecting anything to be there, and the soft touch of that wavy wall jolted her to step back, and she felt something cool and vinyl-like against her shoulders. She froze, her feet planted, and then she whispered, Danny? Silence. With her eyes wide open, but still in the dark, she was more afraid, calling out, Danny? Silence. Danny Shea, where are you? She yelled, and then she heard his muffled voice from high and far away. Don't move, Alice. You have to stand perfectly still. And then the darkness exploded in sound. Danny had hit the switch for the intermission music, and the giant speaker horn centered behind and only a few inches away from the screen swelled with the wail of a clarinet announcing a rhapsody. Alice's body expanded and trembled at the same time, and before she could cry out, the blackness in front of her was split by a gauzy vertical line of blue light that appeared directly in front of her and began expanding outward. The heavy front curtain was parting in front of her. The footlights were flooding the stage with blue, and Alice went from frightened to possessed, from trembling to vibrating, as if the concentrated blue notes behind her had to pass through the prism of her body to fill the auditorium in front of her. With the heavy front curtain completely open, Alice stood behind the inner sheer curtain, waiting for it to separate so she could step forward toward an audience of empty seats. Danny had planned it for weeks, picking the right music, making sure the curtain pulleys were serviced so they would not squeak when they started to roll, replacing any burned-out footlights, timing everything, imagining her on stage, wishing he could be there with her, but knowing that he was the one who had to pull all the switches and make it happen. This night, as soon as the last switch was turned, he knew he could race from the projection booth down to the front row of seats in 40 seconds. The same 40 seconds it would take for the sheer curtain to completely open. Danny? Alice stood in blue, looking for Danny. Danny, are you there? Somewhere. She laughed. She wanted to sing. She wanted to spin in a circle, make herself dizzy, dizzier, and then fly away. She wanted the moment to last forever. Alice. She looked down, and there he was, standing on the floor below the stage, looking up at her. A few minutes earlier, he had been in the booth, looking through the small window, seeing her appear behind the sheer curtain as the front curtain had parted, as if she were on the screen itself. And now, looking up at her only a few feet away, she was bathed in blue, more of a statue than an image. She had looked down at him, and he knew how the footlights could be almost blinding if you faced them, so he was not disappointed to see her turn her face away from him and look upward, as if searching for something. And then the flutter of her eyelids, the quick gasp of a breath taken in and released as she found it. Oh, Danny, I can see the stars. Her face tilted up to see the ceiling. And then with a quick glance down, she motioned for him to come up with her, but he shook his head. She didn't mind. They had all the time in the world. Now, all that being said, you know they've had this affair. It takes 2 years for them to get to that point. It is a long, slow dance of her resisting the obvious attraction, him not knowing how to handle it. And so by the end of the 2 years, they consummate it. But I'm not going to read that chapter to you. It's the chapter that is the reason my wife doesn't come to these readings. She just says, where did you get that from? Where'd you read that? And she also, as I was explaining earlier, that every time I explain the plot to this book and my wife was in the audience, everybody sort of turns to look at her. And she goes, no. She says, no, you were on your own. Now, go, sin no more. So that is the basic plot. And the book moves around in time, and it's very graphic in parts. They go to New York, they go all sorts of places, and then by the end of the book, Alice, could you hold up one of the new copies? Yeah. That cover there. I'm not giving you too much away, but that's the last chapter of the book. It's a flashback. Now, what happens at that, you have to find out. But it's this sort of moment of perfection that she keeps telling her therapist all about, because the therapist keeps saying, was this ever real? Did you ever think you could get, what was, and then this woman starts pointing out to the therapist, oh, you know, you were there. The therapist is like, I've had patients who try to shift blame and responsibility and be evasive, but nobody's ever said that I was actually the person that helped her have the affair. All of this gets explained. So I'm going to slow down here because just to see if there are any questions or comments, or to let you know, Alice is over here for Beaverdale Books is selling copies of the book. And I'll be glad to sign anything, talk to you, answer questions. If you have other books by other writers, I'll be glad to sign those as well. I do a great Richard Russo. This is really true. I mean, I do great. So how do we want to do this now, Ricky or somebody else?
I think Jan, anybody?
Jan. And, you know, we talked about sitting down, but is it okay if I stand up? Thank you. It goes back to my Southern Baptist preacher days.
We can start with that.
Oh, that scares my students when I explain to them. I say, I don't want your soul. I just, bring your body, bring a brain. You're on your own. Then I tell them about the job at the strip club right after the preacher job, and they get confused.
The preacher shows up in, I believe. Oh, sure. Sorry. I don't think it's on. That's it. Oh, it is. Okay. Okay, so the preacher shows up in A Good Man.
I have this real odd relationship with God, which is like, what's the word? Are you there, God? It's Dorothy or something. Yeah, I always feel like that. I mean, this relationship, having grown up, raised by a fundamentalist Southern Baptist mother who obviously did a lot of damage, and at the age of 15, going out and being possessed and going out and doing services and tent things and lay ministry and all that. And then losing that faith at the very early age, going to work at the Green Gate Club in San Antonio as a master of ceremonies at a strip club at the age of 18. I've never gotten away from the basic question. And it's even in this book as well, because at this enormous, there's a moment of enormous stress for Alice, and her husband is a devout believer, and they stop going to church, and he says, I won't do it until you're ready. And she has to lie to him because she knows how much it means to him, so she goes to church for him. In Flamingo, you have an agnostic father, very devout Catholic mother, and an atheist neighbor funeral home director who belongs to 7 churches and a synagogue for business. He just to make the contacts. And in A Good Man, the basic premise is the second coming of Christ, a minor event. And the drunk radio guy doesn't believe it. And he's in the middle of a hurricane in Florida. This black preacher shows up, announces the second coming, and the drunk named Harry said, yeah, right. And he spends the rest of the book trying to debunk this, but the more he gets into it, the more he realizes there's something going on here, and this second coming requires something that he wants to prevent from happening. And that gets resolved in the last paragraph. So yeah, this whole concept of preachers, it never goes away. I haven't resolved it myself.
Well, let me ask one more, and then we'll take some of these questions. I think in many ways you're really a writer's writer, and I find myself reading his books and missing half the illusions because I read a lot of British novels and British literature and not as many American novels. But I think, maybe talk a little bit about the writers that have influenced you and how they kind of appear in different ways.
Yeah. Any writer who can't pick another writer that they wish they could steal from or at least temporarily be is I don't think, being honest with themselves. Because as I tell students very early, nobody becomes a writer unless they're a reader first. You really, bookmobile, Bossier City, Louisiana at the age of 12, that little puppy would come by Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I'm down there, you read and you read and you absorb and you absorb. And if you really make a giant mistake with your life, you go to, college and become an English major, and then you really have to study that stuff, and it just ruins it for you. And then you go to graduate school and you study it some more. But you do learn some things by that study. And so I couldn't be the writer I am today unless I had read Flannery O'Connor, unless I had read Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. These are sort of standard responses, who are the writers that influenced you? I know who didn't influence me. Ernest Hemingway, sort of put that away real quick. Didn't like his style. It didn't appeal to me at all. I like the sort of struggle that, especially on O'Connor, the sort of grotesque. In that book, A Good Man, it comes from an O'Connor story. Good man's hard to find. I mean, I had to get permission from the publisher. I used a paragraph verbatim from O'Connor at an important part of my book, but the character is also based upon a Flannery O'Connor character from a short story called The River. Those are the sort of details that you don't need to know, but they have shaped style. The sort of ironic emphasis on a little bit of exaggerated, but at the same time you keep thinking, that's got to mean something. I mean, when you read O'Connor and you read that good man's hard to find, at the end, when the misfit puts 3 bullets in the heart of the grandmother, I'm not giving much away. I thought at the time, that's got to mean something. I don't know what, but she was so heavy-handed, but at the same time, so obscure. I like that. Now, playing with ambiguous, unreliable narrators and time. I do a lot of time shifting, jumping around. Sometimes in the same paragraph, you're at 3 different times in a person's life. I don't know where that comes from. Maybe that's just lack of discipline on my part. I'm thinking too many things at once. But I always tell people that there are some writers you read before you die. O'Connor's certainly one of them. You can't consider yourself well-read. You don't have to like her, but you do need to read her.
Yeah, I had never read her until Larry explained the influences, and I didn't like her. I like Faulkner better. Anyway, well, let's get back to some of these questions. So, back to Alice in particular. As you describe Alice, she is engaged in behaviors that are unconscionable, especially to those of us who teach. What makes her a sympathetic character? Now, I'm going to interject something here before he answers. I don't think she is a sympathetic character. I don't like her. And he said...
I don't like her either. You don't have to like this woman to keep turning the pages. Somebody once, it's like watching a train wreck. You just slow down, our car. It's like, whoa, let's see the bodies. Let's see the maimed, crippled bodies here. She's damaged. She's very severely damaged. In fact, the biggest damage done in her life, long before she even meets this boy, came out of me knowing somebody that happened to. And I won't tell you what it is. It is the worst possible thing that can happen, I think, to another human being and still live. That's what happens to this woman. I also, when I started writing about this, it's in the news, it's Law and Order based on real. I didn't want to do one of those high school teacher sleeps with a 14-year-old boy sort of thing. That's sort of creepy. I mean, that is creepy. And it's one of the reasons that it's like there's this age gap, and yet it's resisted. So they meet when he's 18, and not in high school, he's in college, but then it's another 2 years before they actually consummate this. But the age gap is always there. So the age gap, the fact that she's married, the fact that she has been promiscuous long before she met this young man. I think the most interesting character in the book is the husband. You just have to sort of figure out what... She has this line in which she'd fooled around a lot with other men, and then she met this boy, Danny, and she tries to explain to her husband why it was a good thing that she said, I stopped cheating on you when I started sleeping with Danny. That is one of the keys to this story. One, because he looks at her and says, oh, well, let's just invite the young man over. Let's have dinner. Let's all get together. And he just blows up, but he doesn't go away. He knows the young man too. He knows the young man's story as well. One of the reviewers of this book said it's a book about enablers. She doesn't do this everybody knows this is going on for 20 years. All of Danny's friends and family know it. Her husband knows it. How does that happen? You don't have to like her. In fact, if you know somebody like her, you might want to put some distance between you and that person.
Yeah, I have to say, after he said that, and I think our book club was somewhere in the middle of all the Larry books.
Let me say something about your book club.
Okay.
One of the things that I was really concerned about in this book is writing sex scenes for women. So I sent chapters to Ricky's book club. And I just assumed the best when I didn't get like responses saying, that little barf bags full of just whatever. It was okay. So you were a sounding board, you and your group were a sounding board. And I did this with a lot of other women as well, because, it's a completely different type of book for me to get into the mind of a, not just female, but delusional female. Another reason that my wife refuses to come to these, because she says, they're just going to think it's me, Larry. No, she's not.
So, sort of a different question from a different angle. What was the biggest change to your life after Flamingo Road was published?
The biggest change in my life?
After Flamingo was published.
That's easy. I paid off my house, paid off my school loans. I added an addition to my house. I paid off every debt and credit card debt. I put money in the bank for my two children's college education when they were 10 and 12 years old. And I set up a retirement fund. Now, it's all been downhill after that. My children certainly took care of those college funds, and then they got into my retirement fund. But the really good answer is it really took the pressure off me to work. I was writing when I could, like most writers. You have obligations, families, work. First book out, a good advance. Then the Hallmark movie came along, and there's more money there. I didn't like the movie, but as I'm saying, I don't like this, and my wife kept saying, sign the check, sign the check. So it allows me time to actually write full time. I mean, I've already finished another first draft of another novel, and I'm working on a film project now. So the biggest change is I don't get a lot of sympathy from other writers now. Say, oh, excuse me, your second book didn't sell as much as you wanted to. Oh, excuse me. How much did they pay you for the first book? Oh, excuse me, Larry. It's a vicious racket. No.
Okay, so sort of a couple related questions, and I'm going to reverse the order of them. So it's, what is your writing process, and what are you working on now?
Okay. The process is very simple. It used to be very simple, and then my wife retired. And you notice, I talk a lot about my wife, and I do that because she's not here. And I told her, when you don't show up, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to tell all sorts of stories about you. My wife just retired last week, 30-something years at the university. All that time, I've been at home by myself. My kids go to school at 8 o'clock in the morning, come back at 3. I got the house to myself. That's my life for 30-something years. I get a lot of work done that way. I don't know about the future, because the first draft of this book I just finished, I had finished it before she retired. So I suggested a part-time job, and she says, good, why don't you go get one? She's earned the rest. So the process when I'm writing, turn off the phone, turn off the TV, sit down with a cup of coffee, which is great for productivity. Didn't do that until I was 45, my first cup of coffee. Start for a couple of hours. It's like getting muscle memory going again. Read what you wrote the day before. After about 2 hours, you start kicking in and writing, and I can get 4 to 5. Good day, 10 pages done. Sometimes not great, but as I tell other kids especially, the trick is to do it. And then you can go back and make it better. Just do it. So 5 days a week, don't do weekends, don't do summer vacation when the kids were home. 4 o'clock when my wife came home from work, work ended. 5 o'clock, vodka tonics, now, we'll see how it goes for the future. I was just explaining my other project. The new book is called The Education of Nancy Adams. It's about a 49-year-old woman who's going to work for the first time in her life. She had been married. She went to school, got certified and all this other stuff, but she married a doctor, well off, never had to do anything. He's killed in a plane crash, bukus of money, which she burns through after about 5 or 6 years. And so at the age of 49, she gets her first job as a teacher in the high school she graduated from 30 years earlier, where she was valedictorian. And she's now back, first-time, first-year teacher. And the man who hired her, the principal of the high school, was her high school English teacher who she was in love with in high school. And he, at the time, married another teacher. And so this woman is just never gotten over this, and she thinks this must mean something. The planets are lining up. But no. And as he says to her, there's a student here I think needs you. It's a young girl, and she really needs an older woman like you to help her. Well, this character thinks to herself, I could have done without the older woman reference. But it's right. She's going to sort of take over this young girl who's a single, unwed mother, who's a brilliant student, but bad luck. And there are all sorts of rumors about this child of this girl being connected to the principal, who is almost 60. And because this girl lives with the principal and his family and the child, what this woman has to figure out is, what is the truth? Once she realizes, no, there's nothing between him and me. He's a wonderful man who adores his wife. What planet have I been on all these years? And yet, he is somebody who needs protection. And I don't know if any of you are teachers, but in this particular high school, it seems to be somewhat of a snake pit with certain teachers against other teachers. And that's the first draft, that's the plot, and that's what I'm working on now.
Okay, I was laughing when he said at the beginning something about the husband dying, because if you read all of his books, and I would urge you all to do that, they're great books, he's into death. And I said at one point, I don't know, a couple years ago, I said, can you write a book without somebody's dying?
Can you live without somebody dying? Love, sex, and death. I like to keep my plots simple. And how many other ambition, greed, all those other things I suppose you could write about. But I love writing. This is the first book where I've written sex scenes, but I love writing death scenes. And I love writing death scenes where you sort of don't know that this is where it's going. Now, the classic example, my first novel, there's a death of a major character near the end of the book, which I knew was coming. And I put it off for 3 months. I didn't even write that scene. So there's a certain point where a character goes down to a theater box office looking for this other character, and the reader realizes, oh my God, that person is about to die, and only this 16-year-old boy knows it, and he is responsible for the death, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. And so at that point in the book, up through death and funeral, it was about 17 pages. I wrote that in one day. And that's the only part of that book which has never been changed. It is word for word exactly as I wrote it. And I go, and I have people call me up after, and that's not the end of the book. They call me up and say, what did you just do? How could you do that? And I'm still shaking. I love writing about death. It's like the whistling past a graveyard. You can write about it, it ain't going to happen, I could write my own. Therefore, if I've written it, I'll take care of that. It's not going to happen. So is there a God and what happens after you die? Other than that, I have no real interest in life.
One of the things that really shows up strongly in your books, except for this one, although it's there a little bit, is place. And the places are characters in and of themselves.
Yeah, as much as I talk about themes and symbols and plots and characters, I like to have real places that I write about, not imaginary places. I put fictional characters in Iowa City, fictional characters in St. Augustine, Florida, fictional characters in this book in Atlanta and St. Augustine. You did get all that on tape, right? Okay. All right, good. Okay. So I like writing about Florida because it's got an ocean. That's about all it's got, really. I'm sorry. Anybody here from Florida? I tend to pick on Florida a lot. I live there. I have familiar with it. I grew up in Texas and went to college in Oklahoma and lived in Florida. I mean, you cannot get any more dysfunctional than those three states, and I've lived in all three of them. And I like St. Augustine because it is the oldest city in America, 1565, continuous settlement from 1565. And I think this goes back to the O'Connor influences when you're dealing with a story in the oldest city in the world makes it the oldest story in the world, in America. Indeed, this is a timeless story, and I like to have it in the oldest place. And especially in Flamingo, you got to have the ocean. In the ocean, in Flamingo, there's an emphasis on water and land and air, and I'm going to start talking like an English teacher, and I'm going to stop. But yes, place is important.
Other questions from you all? Because I could talk to him forever. We just do. Yeah.
I heard you say, I didn't know how it would go writing sex scenes for women. Are you specifically targeting women as the audience for your book?
You want to repeat that question for the, I don't know if they picked it up.
She asked about this business of writing sex scenes for women. I think it was more from a women's perspective, or you weren't sure how women were going to take it, since it was presumably from a woman's perspective.
The first three books, the main characters are men, and they're sort of surrogates and projections of issues that I understand very well, I think. So this one was a conscious effort to be completely different. And I literally, in addition to sending chapters to your group, I would sneak opinions from women without them knowing I was getting really personal and gonna I would ask women that I knew, so what's the worst thing you've ever done to your husband? I mean, I'm not talking in the house, I mean that he doesn't know about. And of course, they never would tell me until, about the second drink. And I was shocked at what information you can get. You don't need water torture, advanced interrogation, you just need alcohol. The book I'm writing now, I'm actually going to send you and other people a question. Tell me what it was like to be 49 and female, physically. When you wake up in the morning, what does it feel like? When you go to bed at night, in the middle of the day, what is your body telling you? And just get as many different things from that perspective as I can. The sex part, there's sex in all my books. Flamingo, Hallmark, when Hallmark did Flamingo, they told me they weren't going to do the sex on the beach scene. They literally said, we don't do sex on the beach. And I said, I can live with that, all right, because you would screw it up anyway. It's a Hallmark movie, you're not going to do that. But here's the thing, that book, Flamingo Rising, is taught in high schools all over the country. And the sex scene is not an issue. There are two other issues. One is what I do to the dog. That gets me in more trouble than the sex. But in that sex scene, there are no body parts. It's just page 140 something. It is the sensation.
It's floaty.
It's midnight. A lot of things happen on my books at midnight. It's completely dark on the beach, so he cannot see anything. It's every other sense: touch, taste, smell, hearing. I tried to put all of those, incorporate those into a scene of the loss of virginity. And it's very different than this one, because this one is, it was wicked on that couch. This comes up, that goes down, this goes in. It's two adults talking to each other. And one of them, I will give you this line, the most profound line of the realization that this woman has as she's literally sitting on top of this young man on the couch after having sex, is she just looks up and she thinks to herself, my God, what have I done? And it hits her at that moment that she cannot go back to being who she was before. It wasn't just the sex, it was the sex with that boy at that time in that situation with all their history, and she realizes, I'm in love. It's beyond just simply physical. And that's the scary part. It might also be the delusional part too, because he's supposed to love her. I don't know if I answered the question or not, but yeah, this is a very different kind of book, and my other books, obviously, men characters. As my publisher said on this one, my God, like, we're not going to sell 4 copies of this book to any man in America. And this was before this 50 Shades of Grey thing, you know. And I did a bookstore reading last week in Milwaukee, and the store owner said, I read your book, I read 50 Shades of Grey. This is shameless self-promotion, excuse me. She says, yours is so much better. And I said, and how many copies have you sold? She said, I have sold so none. I said, you work on that for me, all right? Yeah, it's sex is like religion. It becomes consuming after a while, and it makes you crazy. Can make you crazy.
I think we had time for one more question. There was somebody over here, I think.
See, Jan asked me that sex question. I walked in the hall 4 hours ago. She said, I can ask you about the sex. She says, I really want to know about, honey. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Somebody over here had a question, I thought. No? All right, well, let me ask one more. What's your favorite book that you've written?
Oh, favorite book?
Yeah, of yours.
Oh, of mine? Well, obviously this one.
Oh, right, yeah, sure.
I'll be honest with you. This is it's like, which of your children do you love more? Is that a fair question? I love them all the same. I will say that a good man, the character in A Good Man, a man named Harry Ducharme, based on the Flannery O'Connor character, and also a character from a Harry Chapin song called W.O.L.D. I am the morning DJ from W.O.L.D. That character is far and away my favorite character of all. I mean, I find Harry the most tragically likable person in the world. And for no other reason, you should read that book just for that. Plus the fact that Alice needs the business.
So, no, I think I read that one first and then read Flamingo, which is chronologically reading them backwards, but it has an interesting effect when you do it that way. Anyway, other questions? Yeah, one more.
Do you have any training in writing?
No. You don't train to be a writer. You read, and this is what I tell everybody. You pick up sentence structure, rhythms, word usage. You see how you can stretch things, how other people stretch things. They give you ideas. I've never been to a workshop. I was not part of the writer's workshop. I just started writing. And a lot of the stories I tell in Flamingo especially, I used to tell orally as little short 15-minute stories and then put them down on paper, polished them over time. And you can, training helps somebody who already can write, but it doesn't teach you how to write. Yes, ma'am.
Which do you like better, the initial idea generation and the beginning stories, or refining?
Which do you like better, the initial, getting the initial idea and figuring out where you're going, or the actual refining, the rewriting process? Which part do you like better?
Oh, I like the last line, getting to the last line. And I don't mean to be glib, because I think a lot of writers will say, starting it, you got to get inertia and momentum, and you got to get involved with it and keep going, and you're changing stuff. But boy, when you get to the end, it starts really getting faster and faster, and you sort of know where it's going. And sometimes the reader, the characters will halt you and keep you going in a different direction. But I remember, for example, writing the last line of every one of my books, and I always do this thing where I date it and time it, this day and time, just for a record. And there's just like, and of course, then you wait a few days, and then you go back and work on it a little bit, polish it up a little bit. There's nothing better as an avocation, a career. There's nothing better than writing a story and finishing it. And then you make it better, and you come out here, and you meet people, and they ask you about sex scenes and stuff like that. No, starting is a real hassle. The real thrill is when you figure out where the characters help shape the book. And so Jan's over there going like this, all right.
Okay, well, thanks to Jan Kaiser, to the Library Foundation, and everybody for coming out, to Larry Baker.
Thank you very much.